Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. In 2021, 2022, the FBI did over 3 million U.S. person queries of this giant 702 database, of this giant haystack of information. 3 million queries of United States persons. And make no mistake, query is a fancy name for search. 3 million Americans' data was searched in this database of information. And guess what? The FBI wasn't even following their own rules when they conducted those searches. That's why we need a warrant. 278,000 times, not Jim Jordan talking about it, not Ranking Member Nadler talking about it. Washington Post reported last May that 278,000 times the FBI found, the Justice Department found, that they didn't even follow their own darn rules when they searched this giant haystack, this giant database of information on Americans. And so what we're saying is, let's do something that the Constitution has had in place for a couple hundred years that has served our nation well and protected American citizens' liberties. Let's make the executive branch go to a separate and equal branch of government, the judicial branch, and get a probable cause warrant to do the search. After all, it's done pretty well for this great country, greatest country ever for a long, long time. Why wouldn't we have that here? And oh, by the way, in a bipartisan fashion, coming out of our committee, 35-2 vote, we said we will even put exceptions in there. If it's an emergency situation, the FBI doesn't have to get a warrant. They can do the search. If it's an emergency situation, they can do it. We put exceptions in there. Here's the fundamental question. I raised this the other day. Here's the fundamental question. Of that over 3 million searches in a 2-year time span, how many of those aren't covered by the exceptions we have in our warrant amendment? What's the number? And guess what? We can't get an answer. They won't tell us, which should be concerning in and of itself. But if it's a big number, we should be particularly frightened. If they don't follow the exceptions and they're searching Americans, searching your name, your phone number, your email address in this giant database, that should scare us. And if it's a small number, then what's the big deal? You don't need thousands if it's a small number. But we can't get an answer to that question. So the underlying bill has got some changes and reforms that are positive, that are good. But short of having this warrant amendment added to the legislation, we shouldn't pass it. This amendment is critical, particularly when you think about the 278,000 times they abused the system, didn't follow their own rules. And now we say, oh, we got some new rules, they'll follow them now. No. The real check we have in our system is a separate and equal branch of government signing off on it. That's how we do things in America. And never forget, this is the FBI who's had some other abuses in different areas. This is why we think this warrant requirement is so darn important. And with that, I reserve the balance of our time. Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman reserves.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 5, printed in House Report number 118-456. Offered by Mr. Waltz of Florida.
Pursuant to House Resolution 1137, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Waltz, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield myself such times I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Yes. All right. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of my amendment to permit the use of 702 information to vet foreign nationals entering the United States. This amendment enables the thorough vetting of all foreigners being processed for travel into the United States, whether that's a foreign national applying for a visa, applying for legal immigration, or crossing illegally our southern border. This is what I think a lot of Americans probably don't realize. Currently, Section 702 has only been authorized to collect information to support some Department of Homeland Security efforts to screen and vet foreign persons applying for travel or immigration to the United States. This amendment will enhance the vetting of all foreigners who come here. If national security concerns are found through this vetting, these results will be provided to the Department of Homeland Security, the State Department, and the Department of Defense to ensure the federal government is making the most informed decision before we allow foreign nationals admission. Mr. Speaker, we are 3 years into the worst crisis at the southern border in the history of the United States. And last year, Customs and Border Protection recorded 2.5 million encounters with people attempting to cross the United States from Mexico. Alarmingly, over the last 2 years, CBP has apprehended more than 70,000 special interest aliens, people from countries identified as having conditions that promote or protect terrorism. Mr. Speaker, the FBI director is ringing the alarm bells with the over 300 people on the terrorist watch list that are now somewhere in America, compared to just 12 under the last administration. This population includes 538 aliens from Syria, 659 aliens from Iran, 2 state sponsors of terrorism, I might add, in addition to 139 from Yemen, which right now houses the Houthis, and over 1,600 from Pakistan. We just saw ISIS-K attack Moscow. We just seen 6 plots stopped in Europe. And I fear that we are about to suffer another attack like San Bernardino, like Pulse nightclub, or God forbid, another 9/11. And equally concerning, the fastest growing group entering through our southern border is now from China, our #1 adversary. Over 24,000 Chinese nationals have been apprehended at the southern border just in the last year. Of the 1.3 million illegal immigrants in the United States with deportation orders, over 100,000 are Chinese nationals. The American people expect us to use every tool we legally can, every intelligence piece of equipment, every database that we can to protect them against foreigners who would mean us harm. Mr. Speaker, we have these tools. We have reformed the abuses of these tools, and we have to allow our national security professionals to have the best information possible to keep Americans safe. We can't wait until there's another attack and then throw up our hands in this body and say, why didn't we stop it? I am astounded, frankly, that any Republican would oppose this amendment after we have been here time and time again saying we have to protect our border, we have to protect Americans, and if you want to come to the United States, fine, you need to do so legally, but you know what? We're going to look into your background. We're going to make sure you're not a terrorist. We're going to make sure you're not a Chinese national spy that means to do us harm. So, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support this and use every tool we can to keep Americans safe. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield. I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I rise to claim opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Now they want to expand it. This is the second amendment in a row where they're going to expand FISA. Can't have a warrant for the existing program. No, can't. This giant haystack of information can't have a warrant when you go search American citizens there. But now they want to expand it and tell us you still can't have a warrant. Holy cow. Pretty soon this is going to be everybody gets to get searched for any darn reason they want. That's not how it works in America, at least not how it's supposed to work. The Third Amendment is going to expand it too. We spent all morning talking about the warrant requirement, which should be so obvious, and they want to expand it. Now, look, I understand we got a border problem. Holy cow, do we understand that? And I may not agree with my Democrat colleagues on how to fix it. In fact, I know I don't. But this expanding FISA, I mean, you've got to be kidding me. This amendment authorizes surveillance of a whole new category of individuals. We should absolutely vet foreigners who seek to enter the United States, whether legally or illegally, but Congress should not expand FISA or Section 702 beyond its current scope of authorities. I mean, this whole year we've been focused on our committee on limiting FISA, reining it in so that we still can do what we need to be done, look after bad guys, look at bad guys, but not infringe on Americans' liberties, and this just expands it. That's not what the purpose of this bill is. We should address the border problem. Holy cow, our committee spent a boatload of time on it, and that's an issue where unfortunately we didn't get a 35-2 vote on H.R. 2, which was a good piece of legislation. But this is going to sweep up so many more Americans where the FBI 278,000 times, not illegally, but didn't follow their own rules when they queried the database, but now they got even more. Holy cow, this is the wrong way to go. With that,
Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the ranking member is right. The vote was 35-2 on a major piece of legislation. That doesn't happen a whole lot, I should say, in our committee. So I want to thank our committee. I want to thank the members on the Republican side who worked so hard over the last year putting this legislation together. We had 3 individuals in particular, Ms. Lee, Mr. Biggs, Mr. McClintock, who served on a task force focused on trying to get this right. I think they've got a good product if, as the ranking member just said, the warrant amendment is actually adopted into the base text. I also want to thank the Democrats who worked so hard, and their staff working with our good staff on putting this together. Ranking Member Nadler, Ms. Jayapal, and several others working together to defend a fundamental principle. The Judiciary Committee is supposed to be that. I mean, we're all supposed to do this, but where it's really focused is the Judiciary Committee is supposed to be that committee that is determined to make sure Americans' liberties are protected. And I think the staff and the members have worked hard to put together a product that will do that if, in fact, this amendment gets added here in a few minutes. When the folks who started this country came together, they had it right when they created separate and equal branches of government. The checks and balances in our system are good. They protect our rights, our liberties, key principles. And we should adhere to that. As I said earlier, it served us well. This amendment follows that fundamental principle. So I hope we adopt it. And then if we adopt it, I hope we adopt the legislation. With that, I yield back our time.
Gentleman has 1.5 minutes remaining.
I yield a minute to the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Jordan.
I thank the gentleman. I'm just going to point out my good friend from Ohio. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm just going to point out my good friend from Ohio says that we're searching foreigners in this database. Well, if you're just searching foreigners, why do we have this distinction called U.S. person queries? If you're just searching the bad guys, that's one thing, but you're not. Or you wouldn't have violated U.S. person queries 278,000 times. So that's the fundamental distinction. You can search all the bad guys you want. That's what we want. Do surveillance on them. They're in the database. You want to search more about them in the database, go do it. But you want to search an American. Their name, their phone number, their email address, you got to get a warrant. That's all this does. We shouldn't make it too complicated. That's all this does. Mr. Hines just used the term U.S. person queries. That's not a foreigner. That's someone here in the United States who's a person, and they're being searched. And all we're saying is, when you're going to do that, go get a warrant from a separate and equal branch of government. Thank the gentleman for yielding.
Gentleman.
With that, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Washington.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. And yes, I agree with Chairman Jordan on an immigration amendment because this is an expansion of the government's ability to surveil. And we have this opportunity right here in Congress today to add critical safeguards, not expand the government's use of this surveillance authority. This inexcusable expansion of FISA will further increase warrantless surveillance, and it is at the expense of a whole slew of innocent immigrants. People seeking to come to this country are not monolithic communities cut off from Americans. Many of them are close family members of U.S. citizens seeking reunification through family sponsorship or just a simple visit. Many others are sponsored by U.S. employers. There is already ample vetting of immigrants. Just look at refugees, who are the most vetted group of people who come to this country. It takes years of vetting through multiple agencies, including the FBI, the National Counterterrorism Center, and other agencies. This amendment is only going to make visa processing backlogs worse. It will further delay American businesses from getting the workers we need to maintain our competitiveness and our ability to attract the best and the brightest. And it could harm local economies that rely on tourism, as delays in processing travel visas deter people from choosing to travel to America. We should not be expanding FISA. We should be creating safeguards to protect foundational civil liberties rights. Now, earlier, one of my colleagues claimed that not a single federal court has identified a Fourth Amendment issue with U.S. person queries. Mr. Chairman, that is false. That is false. In 2019, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit found Fourth Amendment concerns with U.S. person queries, and that issue is still being debated. We are talking about an average of 500 warrantless searches of Americans' private communications every single day. And don't take it from me. Here's a quote from Travis LeBlanc, a Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board member. Here's the quote. Although Section 702 is touted as a foreign intelligence tool,
General Leader is recognized for additional 30 seconds.
although Section 702 is touted as a foreign intelligence tool, it is apparent that a key feature is domestic intelligence and criminal law enforcement. For example, DOJ reported that the FBI has queried over 19,000 donors to a congressional campaign. The FBI has also run numerous improper queries of social advocates, religious community leaders, and even individuals who provide tips or who are victims of crime. 5 million warrantless searches by the FBI of Americans' private communications is 5 million too many. Vote no on this amendment.
General Leader's time has expired. Gentleman from Ohio.
I would just close our time by saying, Mr. Chair, every time you expand FISA, you underscore the need for a warrant. The bigger and bigger this database gets, the more U.S. persons are going to be searched. You underscore the need for a warrant, which we've spent the whole morning debating. With that, I yield back to
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman, Alabama is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to my good friend and Chairman, Representative Jordan.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, a joke is what the Democrats called this bill a joke. It's not a joke to put back in place the policies that worked. In fact, I would call that common sense. Remember what happened on day one of the Biden administration? They said, we're going to get rid of the Remain in Mexico policy. We're going to stop building the wall. And when you get here, you will be released. Well, who the heck wouldn't come if that's the policy? And that's exactly what's happened, on pace to get to 12 million migrants entering the country in the Biden administration. So this bill fixes those things. It says we're going to build the wall, provide money to do so. We're going to go put back in place the Remain in Mexico policy, which worked, and we're going to end this catch and release. And guess what else it does? Guess what else it does? Changes the way they're doing parole. The very program this administration put in that allowed the individual to be released into the country who killed Laken Riley. That's not a joke. That is good policy. Policy that will help protect Americans. Policies that make common sense. So I appreciate the gentleman from Arizona for sponsoring this legislation, Mr. Moore for managing on the floor, and the Judiciary Committee who's worked on this, Republicans on the Judiciary Committee who've worked on this issue for a long time. This isn't quite H.R. 2, but it's close, and it's the policies that need to happen. Again, understand the magnitude of the problem. On pace to get to 12 million migrants coming in this country in a 4-year time span. That's what the Biden administration has given us. Everyone knows that's wrong. Everyone knows the policies they've done intentionally, deliberately, willfully on day one have been harmful to the country. Democrats know it. Republicans know it. Independents know it. Polling shows it all across the country. So let's take a step in the direction of fixing it and pass this legislation. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
I thank the lady for yielding, Mr. Chairman. The government's not allowed to get your information without a warrant. Not allowed to do it. Even if they buy it, they're not allowed to do it. That's all this thing says. It couldn't be more straightforward, more simple. It is a respect for the Fourth Amendment, respect for Americans' privacy. What we're saying is, and it's been said before by the ranking member and Ms. Jayapal and the gentlelady from Wyoming, you can't do an in-run. You can't do a workaround. You can't say, oh, we're allowed to get information we otherwise wouldn't be able to get because we're going to purchase it from a data broker. No, you can't do that. That's all this says. If it would otherwise require a warrant, you can't go buy it. You can't do a workaround. It is a fundamental principle in our country. If the executive branch wants to get your stuff, wants to look at your information, they have to go to a separate and equal branch of government and get a probable cause warrant. They can't go around that and say, oh, we're purchasing, this is public. They can't do it. Plain and simple. And I want to commend the ranking member and the Democrats on the committee. Again, as the ranking member said, we very seldom have legislation that comes out unanimous like this. But this committee, charged with more than any other committee in Congress with protecting American civil liberties, their rights, the fundamental principles and liberties that make our country the best place ever, unanimously agreed this thing should pass. So I want to thank them. I want to thank Ms. Hageman for leading the debate in the committee for our team, and of course the sponsor of the legislation, Mr. Davidson. This is so simple. Last week we had a similar fight, similar debate. Unfortunately, we lost 212 to 212. Let's hope we can win this one. I think this makes so much sense, so common sense, so consistent with how this great country has always operated. One branch of government doesn't get a side at all. We have separate and equal branches of government. This branch wants information. The executive branch wants your information. They got to go to a separate and equal branch and get a warrant. They can't go buy it from somebody else and be sneaky about it and avoid what the Constitution clearly mandates has to happen. I urge a yes vote, and with that, yield back to the gentlelady from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the gentleman for yielding. Calls for the destruction of Israel, our dearest and closest ally, are wrong. And attacks on Jewish students on college campuses are wrong as well. So I want to thank Representative Lawler, Representative Gottheimer for this fine piece of legislation, and I want to thank the chairman of the Immigration Subcommittee, the Judiciary Committee. The only way you stop this kind of stuff is to take action. And the Judiciary Committee started that yesterday. We sent a letter both to Secretary Blinken and Secretary Mayorkas asking 3 simple questions. Are the people engaged in this activity, this wrong activity, this radical activity on campuses against Jewish students, are they here on a visa? And if they are, is the State Department taking actions to revoke that visa? And if the State Department is taking those actions, is the Department of Homeland Security looking to remove these individuals? Pretty basic questions. Pretty important questions I think the Congress has a right to know about and the American people have a right to know about if we're ever going to stop the egregious activity going on. In order to stop it, you got to take action. We're a legislative body. We have a piece of legislation that begins that process. Let's pass this legislation. And then let's do the oversight and get the answers to those questions so the bad guys doing this stuff on college campuses can't do it on a visa. Remember, at Columbia, 55% of the student body is here on a visa. So maybe the American people have a right to know the answers to those 3 questions. We posed them yesterday to Secretary Mayorkas and Secretary Blinken. Let's hope we get an answer soon. Let's hope the Biden administration steps up and starts taking action to stop what is going on. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. A little over a year ago, Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders gave the response to President Biden's State of the Union address. And I thought she did a wonderful job, but the line that stuck out to me was in the course of her remarks, she said, the divide in America today is normal versus crazy. And you can start thinking about some of the crazy policies that are advocated by the radical left. I mean, it is crazy not to have a border. It is crazy to think non-citizens should be able to vote in our federal elections. It is crazy to think boys should compete against girls in sports. How about this one? It's crazy in my mind to let a Chinese spy balloon fly clear across the country and then shoot it down. I don't know. I think most people I represent probably shot it down before it went across the country. And it is crazy to defund the police. Americans understand that instinctively. And yet that is something that the left has advocated now for what? 5 years? We should thank the numerous law enforcement officers who have come to Washington, D.C. for Police Week and all those across our great country. Every day, police officers put their lives on the line to safeguard our families and communities. The left's defund the police movement continues to cause detrimental effects across our nation, with attacks against police officers increasing and becoming more brazen. We've all seen it. Saw it on the streets of New York City. We've all seen it happen. The harmful rhetoric that has demoralized our police officers and directly impacted their ability to maintain public safety. Law enforcement agencies across the country are facing challenges in recruiting and retaining qualified law enforcement officers. Why I supported the bill that we just passed. The gentleman from Maryland was right on that one. This resolution is exactly what's needed. Congress must declare that we oppose the defund police rhetoric. House Concurrent Resolution 106 seeks to correct these false and harmful narrative by explicitly condemning efforts to undermine law enforcement agency. This resolution acknowledges and expresses the gratitude of Congress for the dedication and commitment shown by the men and women of law enforcement. Law enforcement officers and their families serve and make sacrifices every single day for the good of our communities. This resolution is rooted in common sense, normal policy. I believe we can all agree that the defund police movement was a disgrace and our police officers deserve better. So let's all work together, take a stand against cutting our police department funding and calling for not abolishing the police, but actually funding our law enforcement officers, again, in our municipalities, in our counties, all over our country. I urge my colleagues to support the resolution, and I yield back the balance of it. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume. On page 1 of his report, Special Counsel Hur said President Biden, quote, willfully retained and disclosed classified materials after his vice presidency when he was a private citizen. Joe Biden not only kept information he wasn't allowed to keep, he shared it with people who weren't allowed to get it. And on page 231, the special counsel told us why President Biden did this. He said, quote, President Biden had strong motivations to ignore proper procedures for safeguarding the classified information in his notebooks. He had decided months before leaving office to write a book for which he got paid $8 million. So we have motive, an $8 million motive. We have the elements of the crime: knowingly keeping classified information, knowingly disclosing classified information. But despite all this, Special Counsel Hur declined to recommend prosecution for President Biden because Joe Biden is, quote, a sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. On page 207 of his report, Special Counsel Hur said Mr. Biden's memory also appeared to have significant limitations, both at the time he spoke to the ghostwriter, Mr. Zwanitzer, in 2017, as evidenced by their recorded conversations, and today as evidenced by his recorded interview with our office. The committees need the audio recordings to determine whether the Justice Department appropriately carried out justice by not prosecuting the president. Because remember what they told us. Justice Department said, we're going to operate independent of the White House. They said, we'll be impartial, independent arbiters of the facts. Okay, maybe so, but what we do know is this: one former president's being charged, Joe Biden's not being. We think we're entitled, actually, we know we're entitled to all the evidence and the best evidence. And the transcripts alone are not sufficient evidence of the state of the president's memory, especially since the executive branch has a history of changing transcripts. We saw this in late April. The transcript the White House put out didn't match the video and audio recording of President Biden's speech. And only after the White House was caught did they change the transcript. And in that case, and in this case, the audio recording is the best evidence of the words that President Biden actually spoke. Following the release of Special Counsel Hur's report, both the Judiciary Committee and the Oversight Committees issued subpoenas requiring Attorney General Garland to turn over the transcripts of the audio recordings of Special Counsel Hur's interviews with President Biden and his ghostwriter. To date, the Attorney General has failed to produce those recordings. In fact, he told us last week he wasn't going to do it, and that is why we're here. Despite the committee's best efforts, the department has continued to withhold the audio recordings of those interviews without providing any constitutional or legal basis to do so. Just hours before the committee was set to meet and consider the contempt resolution, the department notified the committee that President Biden had asserted, at the Attorney General's urging, executive privilege over the audio recordings. It's simple. Attorney General Garland holds information vital to the committee's legislative oversight and the House impeachment inquiry. Remember, this body voted December 13th of last year to enter that phase of our oversight duty and impeachment inquiry. The department has a legal obligation to turn over the requested material. Attorney General Garland's willful refusal to constitutes contempt of Congress. This resolution upholds the institutional power of the House by recommending that the House find Attorney General Merrick Garland in contempt of Congress for failing to comply with the committee's subpoena. Our oversight and impeachment responsibilities are too important to allow the Attorney General to willfully disregard this. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, and we reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman from Ohio reserves.
Recognize the gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I never said I wouldn't testify in front of the January 6th committee. I just want to know what the parameters that testimony were going to be. So I never did say no to that. Second, the Speaker before just said we don't know what we're looking for. We're looking for equal treatment under the law. Special Counsel Hur found Joe Biden knowingly kept classified information. Joe Biden knowingly disclosed classified information. He told us that on the very first page of his report. And then he told us later why he did so. He said he had strong motivation for ignoring classified procedures because he was writing a book for which he got paid $8 million. Again, we have motive and we have him knowingly disclosing classified information. But he doesn't get charged. Yet President Trump does. President Trump does by Jack Smith. Jack Smith, the guy who had to file with the court a notice saying that he actually altered the order of the documents he seized on the raid of the president's home. He had to tell the court that. The physical documents don't match up with the scanned documents. You're not allowed to change the sequence of the documents you seized. But Jack Smith did. Jack Smith mishandled the documents he's accusing President Trump of mishandling. You can't make this stuff up. That's what we're focused on. And oh, by the way, we're in the midst of an impeachment inquiry. We're entitled to the best evidence. That's why we want the audio tape. With that, I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 9106, the Enhanced Presidential Security Act of 2024, requires the Secret Service to apply the same standards for determining the number of agents required to protect presidents, vice presidents, and major presidential and vice presidential candidates. It also directs the Secret Service to conduct a review of the provision of protection provided to these individuals and to report its findings and recommendations to Congress. I support this legislation to ensure that the Secret Service has the tools, resources, and procedures necessary to keep our highest elected officials and candidates safe, which is critical to our democratic system of government. But in advancing this legislation, Republicans are hoping to distract from the common denominator in every successful assassination of a U.S. president, as well as the attempted assassination of President Reagan and the attempted assassination of former presidents and presidential candidates Theodore Roosevelt and Donald Trump. In every single one of these events, the weapon used was a gun. The fact is that the work of the Secret Service is made infinitely more difficult by our lax gun laws. But this Congress, the Republican majority, has repeatedly sought to further weaken our gun laws, endangering our children, our law enforcement officers, our communities, and even their own presidential candidate. Last year, after a mass shooter killed 6 people, including 3 children, at a school in Nashville, Republicans fought to make sure everyone could continue to acquire the accessory that shooter used in circumvention of the National Firearms Act. Earlier this year, our Republican colleagues cheered as the Supreme Court, stacked with Republican nominees, struck down the regulation of bump stocks, allowing the accessory used in the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history to again be available to the public without even a background check. When the Senate tried to bring up legislation to again regulate bump stocks, Senate Republicans blocked it. Similar legislation in the House has just one Republican co-sponsor, and the Republican majority has refused to advance it. Just today, Republicans used their control of the Judiciary Committee to advance a bill that would weaken the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, reinvigorate the black market for guns, and reopen the online and private sale loophole. That legislation would make it so that convicted felons, domestic abusers, and other dangerous persons who are prohibited from possessing a gun could easily get one without a background check. And it would make it so that unlicensed sellers could once again profit from endangering our communities. And it doesn't stop there. Not only have they sought to unravel our gun laws through legislation and our courts, but our Republican colleagues have also sought to defund the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the primary agency tasked with enforcing our gun laws, including by helping state and local enforcement and local law enforcement solve violent crimes and keep guns out of the wrong hands. The cumulative effect of these efforts is clear. We know from headline after headline that it is far too easy for violent individuals to get a gun and then to life, or many lives, in a matter of seconds. That is true whether the attacker targets school children, a domestic partner, a house of worship, or a presidential candidate. The challenges faced by the Secret Service would be vastly diminished if we passed any one of our many proposals to keep guns out of the wrong hands. But over and over, Republicans have prioritized access to deadly weapons over the safety of our communities. I support this legislation because the Secret Service must be able to protect our highest elected officials and candidates. But this legislation will do nothing to make the rest of us any safer or change the fact that gun violence continues to take the lives of more than 100 Americans every single day. As Republicans yet again rush headlong towards a government shutdown, unable even to manage the most basic aspects of governing, and as they continue to oppose every action to prevent gun violence, Democrats will continue to fight to make our communities safer for every American. I nonetheless urge my colleagues to support this modest legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
So let me get this straight, Mr. Speaker. Some crazy guy on the left tries to assassinate President Trump, and it's Republicans' fault? That's what we just heard. Next thing they're going to say is, oh, some crazy guy on the left tries to assassinate President Trump, and it's President Trump's fault. Oh, wait a minute. They said that too. This is ridiculous. We have a bipartisan bill that Representative Lawler went to Democrats, worked with them on something that everyone knows needs to happen. And what does the ranking member do? Says it's Republicans' fault. And what do Democrats do? What do the left do? They say it's President Trump's fault. You cannot make this stuff up. After all that President Trump's been through, they go to that. After they spied on his campaign, after Mueller, after impeachment, after they raided his home, after they tried the crazy 14th Amendment idea. Best way to beat him is not let him play the game, not let him go on the ballot. Thank goodness for the Supreme Court, which decided 9-0 that was bogus. That's what they do? I wasn't even going to talk. I was going to let Mr. Lawler, who's done the work on this, handle all this, and his remarks were totally bipartisan, not partisan at all. We were just going to let this good piece of legislation that's going to go on suspension, everyone's going to vote for, just let it happen. But no, they cannot help themselves. It's ridiculous. I yield to the gentleman from New York who was working in the proper fashion on a good piece of legislation that will protect both, as he indicated in his opening remarks, both former President Trump and Vice President Harris. That's what we want in America. I yield as much time as the gentleman may consume.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler, is recognized.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Chairman. You go to any community, anywhere in this country, walk up to someone on the street and say, do you think it makes sense, in light of the fact that 10 million migrants have come into the country in 3.5 years, 99 of those individuals on the terrorist watch list, do you think it makes sense, before a new voter registers to vote, that they demonstrate they are a citizen of this great country? And any person you ask that question to will say, well, of course. Of course that makes sense. Everyone, Democrat district, Republican district, they will all say the same thing. Everyone will agree with that, except Democrats in the United States House of Representatives. They disagree with that. They say, no, 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 we can't have that requirement on a bill that spends what we're already spending. We can't put that requirement on a bill. That is ridiculous. That is, as Sarah Huckabee Sanders said a couple years ago in her response to the State of the Union, she said, the divide in America today is normal versus crazy. That is a crazy policy position not to agree with that, not to put the SAVE Act on this bill. Think of the positions the left now takes. It's crazy to defund the police. It's crazy not to have a border. It's crazy to say men should compete against women in sports. Those are all positions the left takes, and they take the position that in light of 10 million people coming into our country in 3.5 years, you shouldn't have a requirement to demonstrate you're a citizen before you register as a new voter. The people see this, man. The people understand in this country, this is a crazy, support this legislation. This is a good bill with a common sense, normal policy that we are putting on the legislation. Makes absolute sense. But they're going to vote against it. I urge a yes vote, and I yield back.